Hi everyone. My name is Jessica Feierman. I'm with Juvenile Law Center, and we've been talking all day very broadly about the juvenile justice system, and we've been referring to kids in institutions. And what we're going to do over the course of this next hour is drill a little deeper into what is the experience for those kids in institutions. We had some conversations amongst ourselves about what's the end goal here, but I think the panel before us laid out the end goal. Kids don't belong in institutions, they don't do well in institutions, and there are a lot of community-based solutions that do work. So that's covered. We know it's been a long day, and so we brought you some photographs. They're actually very striking and depressing, but also very moving photographs, because I think what we're trying to do is to get a sense of what's the experience like for a kid. So this set of photographs is all taken by Richard Ross, and I think you can still, if you Google Richard Ross and juvenile injustice, you'll be able to find many more. So again, I'm Jessica Feierman. I'm pleased to be joined today by Vidhya Ananthakrishnan, who is the Director of Youth Justice Initiatives at the Columbia University Justice Lab, and also by Jenny Lutz, staff attorney at Center for Children's Law and Policy, who also is leading the campaign to stop solitary for kids. And a special thanks to Jenny, who I think got landed at 4:30 in the morning and may not have slept at all, but she's here and she's with us, so thank you for that. So we wanted to just start with an overview, and we'll click through some of these slides as we go. So what are the problems that kids face in institutions? Quick list of some of the most egregious. One is solitary confinement, and I think this slide is a pretty good illustration. We have kids spending 22, 23, 24 hours a day in a cell by themselves. And I think sometimes when we hear about solitary confinement, we imagine that it must be a terrible monster who's in there. And the reality is, of course, the stories bear out that these are kids and humans, and a lot of the time they're in solitary confinement we've been talking about normative adolescent behavior. I've had kids, for example, who were disrespectful to staff members, one girl who snatched some gummy bears off of a cabinet, and that, of course, was disobeying a rule of a juvenile facility. Another group of kids who used their pillows to make it look like they were in their beds when they weren't. So kids doing what teenagers do is landing them in solitary confinement. Another slide of solitary confinement. Strip searches. Most facilities around the country are strip searching every youth upon entry, and are then strip searching again when kids have family visits, sometimes when they have lawyer visits, when they go from one place to another, and then definitely when the facility thinks there's contraband. So these are searches that are happening even when there's no reason to suspect that a young person has contraband on their body. And to a population where the rates of sexual assault are very high. Pepper spray. These quotes, incidentally, are from a report that we did at Juvenile Law Center called Unlocking Youth, which was about solitary confinement, but we wanted to get some young people talking about their own experiences. So pepper spray. On that earlier slide, you saw that little slot. We had kids in Wisconsin who were putting their hands outside through the slot and being pepper sprayed because that was disobedient. They shouldn't have had their hands outside the slot. So again, you think, they're using pepper spray because there's a real issue around violence. Of course, there sometimes may be, but in many cases, there's pepper spray applied just because there's fear and power and confusion. Restraints. This is a picture from Lincoln Hills in Wisconsin where the kids were in solitary confinement 22 or 23 hours a day. When they were out, they had their out time, they were often chained like this to the table. Other kinds of restraints we see are restraint chairs, restraint smocks, various ways of confining young people. And in fact, these are related issues. I had one young person who was our client from New Jersey, spent 7 months in solitary confinement. He was just getting so lonely and traumatized by being in solitary confinement that he was acting out in order to get into the restraint chair because then he would have human interaction. So really problematic ways of treating young people that relate to each other. And then physical and sexual abuse, very common. So these issues are pervasive in detention. So when we in the juvenile justice world talk about detention, we're talking about pre-trial or pre-adjudication. A lot of times people use the word detention, I think, just to mean a kid is locked up, but that's a distinction that we make. So in detention, they face these conditions. In youth prisons or youth correctional settings, so after a trial or a hearing, and also when they're in adult facilities. You've heard a lot today about sort of the basic problems around structural racism in our system. I just want to mention a couple of resources. The W. Haywood Burns Institute has an interactive map that can give you a lot of information about the disparities in different states, and the Sentencing Project also has fact sheets that dig deep into the federal data that may be worth looking at as you're thinking about these issues. And two more points on this before I move on. One is that racism in the system, it didn't just appear out of nowhere. So one more really good resource is James Bell's Adoration of the Question. He talks about our history from slavery to convict leasing to black codes, young people, African-American youth who were basically being incarcerated as an alternative to slavery. He talks about Native American youth being pulled from their homes. He talks about immigrant youth and Mexican youth being labeled as feeble-minded, and sort of the history of how this has shaped our juvenile justice institutions. So I won't get into detail there, but I think as we're thinking about how race plays in, it's worth taking a few minutes and really going back to the beginning and understanding the nuance of how it originated and where we are today. One more note is we talk a little bit about data, and maybe we can come back to this, but there's not the greatest data about youth in the justice system. And as we think about collaborations between journalists and advocates for reform, one thing that I think we all want is more information. And so as we continue talking, maybe it's to identify those areas where the journalism community can help us ferret out information. There was a great report on solitary confinement for adults and racial disparities. There's never been one that I've found on that same issue with that same level of data for youth. So keep that in mind. And with that, I will turn it over.
Thanks, Jessica. So thanks, everybody, for having us here again today. And I'm Vidhya Ananthakrishnan. I'm Director of Youth Justice Initiatives at the Columbia University Justice Lab. I actually work with Vinny, who was on our previous panel. The Justice Lab, for those of you who aren't familiar, I would sort of describe as an action-oriented sort of think tank that is really working to shape justice for the future. And we have a number of different projects that we are putting out on different areas, and I'll probably spend a little bit more time on the work that we're doing on the youth justice side in a bit, but just to give you that background. So what I was asked to do today was to sort of help contextualize this problem of institutionalization and hone in a little bit on the scope of like what we're actually talking about, and try to share with you, to some extent, the data that does exist. But before I did that, I actually wanted to start with a little bit of a story. And some of this, I think, is kind of driven by having seen these pictures. And it reminded me of, when I first sort of started at the Vera Institute of Justice many years ago. One of the things that was really at the top of the news and actually drove a lot of what subsequently happened in New York was a story about a boy named Daryl Thompson, who at the time was 15 years old and was being housed at the Tryon Residential Facility, which was a limited, secure, state-operated prison. And this was a prison that looked a lot like some of the pictures you're seeing up there, and there were some really terrible things that were happening. But Daryl lost his recreational privileges at one point while he was there, and because of this was immediately pinned to the floor by two staff members, face down, and within a few minutes had suffocated, and they rushed him to the hospital, but he was already dead. And that story, when it broke, sort of became this big rallying cry in the state. I mean, there had been other stories of abuse, but this became a thing in the state and started to galvanize a lot of attention. And so I bring that story back up in part because it just sort of raises again the power that the media has in helping to raise this issue up and really help people understand what we mean when we say we're locking kids up. And Jessica's already referenced that, it can be in a number of different settings, whether that's detention or a youth prison or an adult jail. But, I think that the bottom line is that, you're depriving these young people of their liberty. And for the most part, it's happening on the backs of young people of color and other sort of marginalized populations. So while we have a lot to be sort of happy about in the sense that, we're not quite at where we were in the mid-'90s when we were at the sort of height of this super predator discussion and so many more kids were being locked up. And things have changed a lot over the years with sort of the advent of all the knowledge we have around adolescent brain development. We still, as a country, incarcerate way more kids than any other country in the world. And in terms of just our own sort of spending priorities, states in this country spend a huge amount of their budgets on youth prisons, with over like $5 billion being spent on prisons. And in any given day, we are incarcerating nearly 50,000 youth in the juvenile justice system. And as I think Vinny said earlier, there was a recent report that was trying to kind of come up with an estimate around youth and adult jails, and that's around 3,700 youth, but that was sort of a one-day snapshot. And in a given year, that number is probably more like 30,000. So it's still a lot of kids. And really, the big thing to note is that even if the numbers have sort of declined, on the whole, the racial and ethnic disparities that are out there still are increasing and persistent. So in terms of that, and Jessica has already referenced the Haywood Burns Institute as a great resource on this. But the disparities are really striking, that Black youth are 5 times more likely to be incarcerated than white youth. Nationally, Latino youth are twice as more likely to be incarcerated. Native American youth are 3.2 times more likely to be incarcerated. And that in some different states, these statistics are just significantly worse. So in New Jersey, we were actually just talking about that today, Black youth are 30 times more likely to be incarcerated than white youth, which is pretty astounding when you stop to think about it. And that disparity starts to grow even starker when we get to talking about kids who have been confined for the most violent offenses. In 2015, in a recent report by the Justice Policy Institute that came out in September, they noted that 7 out of 10 of these youth were actually youth of color, even though Black youth only make up 18% of the youth population. So again, these are really, really significant disparities. It's not just about sort of kids of color. We're talking also about girls and kids with mental health needs who are often also really overrepresented in the system. Largely, those things can be driven by social service needs and family issues that can be driving placements. For girls, their share of the juvenile justice system from courts through incarceration has seen some pretty massive increases. In a report from 2016 called Gender and Justice, it noted that arrests had increased 45% for girls, court caseloads 40%, detentions had jumped 40%, and placement, so girls going into prisons, had actually grown by 42%. And the same has been true for LGBTQ, GNCT girls as well. So all in all, I think the thing to really take away is that incarceration is bad, and it's particularly bad when we're talking about kids of color who are locked up, who don't have the freedom to sort of do the things that we anticipate kids being able to do and being supported to be able to do. That their experience in the system is traumatic and often just triggers some of the trauma that they've already experienced in their lives, whether that's due to some family dynamics, challenging economic circumstances, or sort of physical and sexual abuse. That while we talk a lot about sort of what what offenses kids are coming in for. A lot of why kids get placed is not really always driven by public safety. It's about some of these ways in which we label different behaviors or even what we call felonies or misdemeanors. And a lot of that is about perception and racism, and how adults in particular perceive what is happening, the system actors who make decisions about where kids go. And then once they're in these places that they're, can be very isolated and feel like they're very far from family, both geographically and emotionally, and that the focus sometimes on custody and control is pretty significant and can be horrific. Again, really pushing that trauma to the surface again and again. And then I think one thing that often, and people have taken note of this over time, but once you go into a facility, there isn't always a lot of transparency about what is happening inside. I was looking back at some stories that were done about some of the things that have been happening in Wisconsin, where there's been a big fight around closing youth prisons, and had read the story of a mom who was really focused on the fact that she was hearing things secondhand about what was happening to her son, and was horrified by some of the things that she heard, both through other people who maybe had met up with him or through him on a call, and just this notion that he really wasn't safe. So this sense that it's very hard to penetrate sometimes, and it's important that once that kind of culture develops, that it can be really hard to change it, and that it can make it easier to dehumanize and devalue kids. And then I think, once kids are returning from facilities, and if they've experienced that sort of experience, that it can be hard to integrate back into their own communities without the kinds of supports and things that were referenced in the earlier panel, that it's, you really need to be able to feel connected and tethered to people and the place that you're coming from to feel like you want to sort of stay. And that we can really do a much better job of that. We know that there are better things out there that work. We know that they can be less costly and more effective. So I think it's an important thing for us to really be focused on and make that a goal.
So I actually had failed to tell all of you, but I'd ask folks to start with what's the problem that we're facing, and then we'll move into the solution. But maybe since we've already articulated the problem, Jenny, if you want to do both all at once, that would be helpful.
Hi, everyone. So again, thank you for having us today. I'm Jenny Lutz. I'm a staff attorney at the Center for Children's Law and Policy. We are a small nonprofit that does juvenile justice work in D.C. We focus on three main areas. One is a lot of work with the JDAI initiative through the Annie Casey Foundation to keep kids out of detention and to keep the front door closed, and also to keep kids off of probation or get them off probation as quickly as possible. We also work with systems to reduce racial and ethnic disparities, and we do a lot of work on conditions of confinement, which means that we work with advocates, but also with people who run facilities, so state agencies, county facilities, to try to improve conditions that kids face when they are in custody. Prior to that, I was a public defender for kids in Philadelphia for 10 years. I worked with Elton, who we heard from earlier today. So I just want to start by saying I'm probably going to say a lot of not wonderful things about facilities in general. I do just want to, before I forget, say that there is a movement towards more progressive approaches in the way facilities treat kids. And there are some places out there that are really trying to do things right. So it's not non-existent, and I don't want to forget to mention that. But I do just want to say that as a public defender in Philadelphia or in Pennsylvania is one of the few states that requires representation for kids throughout their entire contact with the juvenile justice system. So that means things aren't just over when a kid gets found guilty and sent away somewhere or put on probation. There are continued hearings, and judges continue to evaluate how kids are doing, and there's lawyers that must appear or that should appear for kids at all those hearings. So I did a lot of work with my clients who were in facilities, and I can by far say that for a lot of them, the greatest impact, usually negative, that the system had on them happened when they were in facilities. And a lot of times, when we watch criminal justice shows, kind of, like Law and Order, it ends with the case, right? A conviction or an acquittal. And for most kids, that's really where a lot of things can begin. And I think that back end of the system doesn't get as much attention as it should. I was speaking to a facility director a couple months ago, and she said the approach that she uses when she talks to her staff and to the community is that when we talk about these young people, she uses the expression "coming soon to a neighborhood near you." So this idea that what happens to kids in facilities and the way we treat them and the way we make them feel about themselves doesn't just stop when they leave the facility, right? It continues in their families, it continues in communities. You look at the story of Kalief Browder, I think is a great, not great, it's a terrible example that really illustrates that point, but it's not, unfortunately, Kalief's story is not an isolated occurrence. The way he was treated and some of the consequences that he suffered afterwards happened to a lot of kids. So we know how harmful any kind of out-of-home placement can be for kids, removing them from their community. And I won't list all of them, but there's a lot of consistent studies that have been done that show placement itself. When I say placement, I mean removal from their home and putting them in a facility for any period of time. It's really harmful to kids. It increases recidivism, which is a very technical way of saying it makes terrible outcomes for kids. It affects how they see themselves, their ability to get jobs. It's trauma in and of itself. The vast majority of placements, in addition to what we've heard about strip searching, solitary confinement, restraints, pepper spray, they do virtually nothing to give kids skills. So basically, we're taking them away, we're putting them in these horrible places, subjecting them to really harmful practices, and then putting them right back in the same situation without giving them any kind of skills to change the outcome. In fact, we're worsening their outcomes. And I think this is a great opportunity in speaking to journalists. I think there's a unique skill set and an obligation both in the defense bar, because of our unique ability to go inside these facilities and speak to clients, and also for journalists to really help get eyes inside facilities. I think as Jessica mentioned, there's very little data on what happens inside juvenile justice facilities. Very few people actually can even get in juvenile justice facilities. Because of the work that my organization does now, I've done investigations or evaluations of 12 facilities this year. So I've been able to actually go inside. They're actually asking, it's amazing opportunity as a public defender to go to a position where they're actually asking us to come in, giving us information, and asking us for recommendations. But by and large, that kind of access to facilities just doesn't exist. So there's a real kind of veil about what happens behind those closed doors. Jessica mentioned a lot of this, but I just want to mention, so we also do work on, we have a national initiative to reduce solitary confinement. And this goes for all of the things I'm going to mention. They're never called that in juvenile systems, right? No juvenile system calls it solitary confinement. They come up with some kind of euphemism. I think in the facility I was just in last, it was risk assessment period or something like that, but they would be in risk assessment period for like a month, right? So it doesn't really make sense. So when we talk about solitary and restraints and restraint chairs and all these other kind of really punitive things that facilities do to kids, it's really a rose by any other name. And that's part of the challenge in getting data, is that everybody defines it differently, so it's really hard to compare apples to apples. So we mentioned restraint chairs. Did we put up a photo of a restraint chair?
There's actually a really very effective picture of a restraint chair that Richard Ross has, but we had licensing for the ones that we showed.
So, but what about the wrap?
They can't hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Question was whether we had pictures of either the restraint chair or the wrap, and the answer is Richard Ross has. I mean, part of the issue, as you all know, is the challenge of getting into a facility to get the information, which is often a challenge for us as lawyers, although sometimes we have our ways, and often a challenge for journalists. I think what's really amazing about these photographs is that Richard Ross was able to get access to so many different facilities around the country. He does have some pictures, I think, both of the Ferguson wrap, so kids being wrapped in a smock so that they can't use their arms, and also of the restraint chair where kids will be in a 5-point restraint, but we don't have those here. So maybe just a couple minutes also on the solutions and where you're going.
Okay, so I mentioned our initiative to stop solitary for kids, and I think that's illustrative of an approach we take generally, which is, number one, to rely on data to the extent that we have it and the extent that we can get it, but also thinking about mechanisms for change or levers for change. And at least when we think about solitary confinement, there's really three main ways to think about it. You can change laws, you can sue facilities and get results that way, or you can get facilities and agencies to change the way they operate. A lot of these practices, when they come down to it, it happens between a staff person and a kid, right? And no matter how great the law you get is, or the settlement you get, if you can't get the facility staff to actually implement and change the way they interact with kids, it's not going to be a benefit to young people. So those are kind of the three ways of thinking about things, and I think it's also worth mentioning it's impossible to, we think about all of these bad practices as symptoms of a much deeper underlying problem, which is that culture that Vinny mentioned of control and subjugation that exists in facilities, and a lot of people don't go in like that, and it's the culture that ends up changing staff. So I think there's also the question when we do work on conditions of confinement about how that relates to ultimately shutting these facilities down. In other words, do we want to make better facilities, or do we want to just stop sending kids to facilities and come up with different, closer to home alternatives to that? By and large, the juvenile justice facility system is doing what it's created to do. It is not some people say it's a broken system, and in many ways it is, but it's also designed to treat kids like this. This is the framework, the carceral framework that we're putting kids into. So do we want to continue to chip away at that system and try to make better facilities, or do we want to try to envision kind of a new system where we don't put kids in these facilities?
Do you want to do a couple words on solutions?
I think ultimately, there's so many different ways that change could come about. And one of the things that we've been thinking a lot about is how do we sort of elevate different players in this discussion around really stopping institutionalization and sort of redesigning a framework for kids and families that is really about kids and families. And at the Justice Lab, we have a very fledgling initiative that is about to come online to sort of do that, and we're calling it the Youth Correctional Administrators for Justice, which is really about convening a group of current and former youth justice administrators to publicly call for an end of the use of juvenile incarceration. And part of that is we really think that these leaders have the power to really transform how others see this, because they've been at the helm of these agencies. They've really been on the inside and seen how things have operated, and in many cases were people who stood up and said, we're not going to keep doing this. We're going to change what this framework looks like. Folks like Gladys Carrion and Vinny and others that we have identified, people who have really been there and done that and made some pretty massive changes in a span of not so much time. So we think that once we have that kind of voice, that we can help sort of guide that message and have them be bold, that we kind of give other administrators who are kind of in this place where there's a lot that's coming at them, politically, there's a lot of different demands from different people in any given state or locality, that having someone to sort of tap and get that encouragement, advice, some messenger and thought leadership from, like, that you can really make change, that you can push people to a tipping point to do things differently. So that's something that we are working on now. And we see them being really useful in the field as a resource, and that they will be able to educate and push forward in a way that maybe some other folks haven't been able to really penetrate, because again, they're sort of speaking to peers that are at times feeling very isolated in this conversation. And as part of that, we really envision being able to work with all the different players that are in this space to really row in the same direction. You know, the sort of ending of youth incarceration or mass incarceration, however we're thinking about this problem, it's not going to end with like one group doing one thing. It's about lots of different people being able to do it, and we envision our group sort of being able to play with all these different players in any given place. And so we really have been thinking about how we'll do that, and that's part of both our challenge and sort of the exciting piece of this work.
So what you're talking about is trying to get a movement started?
Yes,
So it seems like a very hard thing to do. And are you starting at like just a city level or a state level, or?
It's first and foremost, it's about bringing this group together to really identify what those sort of key messages are that we can kind of push forward, and how to make them as bold as possible. And at that point, really being able to then train folks about how we need them and want them to sort of function in their roles. And then I think it's a matter of making people aware that this is a resource that exists, and being able to deploy them effectively in the places where it makes the most sense.
And have you given any thought to how you're going to get the political support to do this?
I mean, we're doing this sort of independent of any sort of government entity. We are doing this as the Justice Lab. I mean, these folks are current and former administrators, but we're not necessarily getting anyone's permission to convene this group. I think and there are plenty of these people that have been around in the field, I think, who have said lots of important and brave things in these different fights. But I don't know that there's been sort of a singular place to go.
Yeah, I didn't say permission, I said support.
Yeah. I mean, I think that we envision that it will be something that people will want. So we've heard from lots of people on the ground already that this is something that they would see as useful, and that they wish they had sort of somebody like this to tap and to call for advice and wisdom when they're sort of being forced to confront a lot of different perspectives.
So right now, I'm sorry, go ahead, please. So, as I understand it, right now there are pilot programs that are alternatives to incarceration. I'm wondering if each of you will take one particular program and evaluate why you think that has components that are useful and that work.
I'm going to be totally non-responsive to the question, so I'm going to apologize in advance because there's a strategy that I want to highlight rather than a program, and I think that's probably where my knowledge base is. But I just wanted to mention one movement for change that Vidhya referred to before in Wisconsin, which has involved some policy advocacy, some litigation, a lot of community advocacy, and journalism. And all of those forces had to come together to move kids out of a facility. So I told you about the gummy bears. That was just one of many. There have been massive problems in this 2 facilities in northern Wisconsin, which incidentally is my home state, so I apologize for its behavior. But the kids were being placed from Milwaukee, more than 90% youth of color, up in northern Wisconsin, where the staff population and the staff hired were almost 100% white. So some of the cultural issues that we had talked about in cultural competency was notably absent. There were Department of Justice investigations into injuries of youth. When they stopped being permitted to physically abuse youth, they were really relying on solitary confinement, pepper spray, and other harsh carceral responses to youth behavior. So we, with the ACLU of Wisconsin and law firm Quarles and Brady, filed a lawsuit, and we called on that same developmental research to make the arguments not only nobody should be treated this way, and youth in particular should not be treated this way, because our juvenile justice system theoretically is supposed to be rehabilitative and positive and supportive to young people. And so that was going on, but the furthest that a lawsuit could get us was probably a judge declaring the practices unconstitutional and calling for an injunction. And we did get a preliminary injunction in that case, but meanwhile the press was putting a huge spotlight on the issue. There dozens and dozens at least of stories about what was happening there, and that was creating some political pressure. At the same time, we haven't talked a lot about, in this panel yet, about the role of youth and families and community members most impacted. There was a group in Milwaukee, Youth Justice Milwaukee, who were consistently saying, we need to bring our youth home. This is not okay, how they're being treated. There also was another lawsuit on behalf of a girl who was permanently brain damaged in the facility that cost the state $19 million. So that's, I'm sure, part of the impetus. But the upshot is not only is there now a settlement to bar these abusive practices, there's also legislation to close those facilities. Now, the legislation is far from perfect, but it's closing facilities that there would just be incredibly difficult even to just stop the most abusive practices, and it's bringing young people closer to home. So it's not a model of a program, but I think it's a model of a solution in which press and advocates can collaborate.
Yeah, and I think, in many ways, the work that I was sort of describing initially, I think a lot of it is born out of the experience of some of these folks who are now going to be in our group as having led pretty large system changes that have relied on collaboration and cooperation among a lot of different players, which is not always easy, but I think is really important. I think close to home, which Vinny referenced earlier today, and the sort of the city of New York and what it did to kind of really bring kids back from those facilities in upstate New York and develop this robust continuum of services in the city was sort of a good example of how that worked. There was a lot of hand-wringing at various points over lots of different things, but I think one thing that was really clear from the beginning and really helped drive the process was this vision that we can do better for kids, and all kids really need the support of being with their families and in their own communities, and that at the end of the day is what we're going to use to sort of be our beacon and push for change. And I think that people really didn't lose sight of that, and that was really important in kind of keeping the train moving and pushing on a system that was built on values that were really about supporting kids. So to me, I think that's the kind of change that we want to keep seeing across the country, and to keep, going as far as we can to sort of to take down what we've built and to really do the best we can for all kids.
Do I have time? No.
Sure, please go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think the best alternative to detention and alternative to involvement, period, is just realizing that the system doesn't need to have contact with all kids, and that for a lot of kids, there really should be, a lot of alternative to detention programs really are just net widening. Those are kids that really don't warrant a response. A lot of kids will desist from criminal behavior, and having contact with them as a system actually makes things worse for them. So I think as a system, we just need to back off. Other than that, I will mention one program in New Mexico called La Placita, which is for Native youth. It's a court-ordered program, but they also take community referrals. I think what makes that program great is the idea that they are completely staffed, organized, and funded by the local community and by tribal elders. So it's really kind of this idea of shifting the power in terms of who sets up alternatives, how they evaluate kids' progress, how they report that to the court, and kind of shifting that power to people in those kids' communities.
Well, how about alternatives to incarceration for kids that are violent, for whatever reasons? What are the alternatives to that? Do they not have to be in some way institutionalized? Have you given any thought to that?
My answer is always just call up Shayna, because she will figure out a way to respond to, and her, the YAP programs are not going to give up. But I think that our assumption is usually these kids are so violent, there's no way we can treat them at home. And I remember we had a conversation about a young kid who had committed a very, very serious offense. And Shana said, well, we could have someone maybe sleep outside their doors if their family's not yet comfortable with them, and really put in place those responsive, supportive services that kids need. I think it's very easy to assume that the solution is in incarceration because it's sort of we're scared, and that's what we've always done. But when you look at the data about what will make us safe long term, incarceration almost never makes us safe.
We all understand that. But my question, I guess, is what's the alternative?
So then that's mine. Mine is call Shana because she'll have an answer, and really like intensive home-based services.
Yeah. I mean, I think ultimately there probably are not enough programs that are really addressing kids who have committed violent offenses or, who have been charged with violent offenses, however that violent and or, felony offense is being defined. That said, I think the same principles apply to most kids or all kids, and that we need to treat them like we would treat all kids, which is you would support them through it and that you really don't give up. I think that's fundamentally what I've heard from people who do this work.
How can you support them through it if they're not restrained from being violent to other people?
And I think, it's going to be this constant question, but I think part of it is that you can't, the assumption cannot be that the kid is bad and we have to we give up, we're not doing this anymore. Like, there has to be some way of involving folks who have been victims of crime in this context as well, and I think there have been some really innovative programs like I know, in New York we all talk about common justice, and that's been a really interesting approach. But, there are, again, not enough that have been out there that have been tested, but it's also not something that can happen always really quickly. For kids who have been involved in violent crime, often it's the product of having been involved in a lifetime of violence. And so it's not going to be undone in like a 6-month program always. Like, it might take a lot longer than that. And that is something that I think people are not always prepared to take on. So
there's going to have to be a lot of experimentation and research before the methodology emerges. Mm-hmm.
Can I just add one point? I think that when we talk about really violent kids, I think we have to think about what do we mean by violent. Sometimes it's like one of those, like, it when you see it, but a lot of behavior that adolescents engage in is not by virtue of, where they are in their circumstances. I can say this as a former public defender, is not truly violent. And there's a great report that the Justice Policy Institute just put out called Smart, Safe, Fair, which talks about how to address and support kids who have committed quote-unquote violent crimes. And I also think that there's a big distinction to make between a kid who, even if you have a definition for violent, and this kid is found guilty and adjudicated of a violent offense, in assuming that they are violent and that they are likely to commit any future violent crime or crime at all, period. Because of what we know about adolescent offending, sometimes these things truly are one-offs, and the idea of doing research, and there's risk assessments, and those are all kind of actuarial tools that can help us determine that. I think we just want to think about, when we are thinking of those tools, that there is gender and racial bias built into those when we think about what a kid's risk is.
Okay, thank you very much. Questions, please? 1 second. Who? Sorry. Hands? Oh, here.
Thanks. So one of you said something about, oh, right, I'm Jaya. I'm a student at CUNY J School, right? I think that way. I had a question about the role of activists. So there are a lot of, I'm hearing from practitioners and lawyers and legal advocates. What about, how do you ally with people who have experienced the juvenile criminal justice system, or maybe just the criminal justice system, people in the community who are organizing about this issue. And I come from this as a former activist who was an activist before she became a journalist, and I know that there's quite a robust movement for all sorts of things, especially here in New York, about criminal justice reform. So I'm just interested to know how you guys interact with them.
I think that's a great question, and we do that at Juvenile Law Center in a couple of different ways, and then you all may have different examples. And one thing that we've done is to create inside of our organization a program called Juveniles for Justice. So we have young people who have been involved in the juvenile justice system who come in, learn more about the system, learn advocacy skills, and also inform us about our work. And then those young people who have been in that program also become a part of our speakers bureau. So often when we're presenting, my perspective is not as compelling and probably not as informative as the perspective of a young person who has experienced the system. I really appreciate the comments from earlier. We have to be very sensitive and careful about sort of imposing on young people to tell their stories when they don't want to, but I think we also need to create platforms when they do want to, because they have powerful, not only insights about their experiences, but about how the system could work. So that's one approach. In Wisconsin, our situation was a little different. We were out-of-towners, but we were very fortunate, in fact, learned, ACLU had learned about this issue, but we got looped in through a national organization called Youth First, who were connected with the folks at Youth Justice Milwaukee, and they were saying, we have such a problem here. We think this is a moment for litigation because our kids are just in they're in grave danger, and we need to do something. And so because we had that connection on the front end, we were able to. We can't share everything that happens in a settlement conversation, for example, but we can talk about the media strategy. We can, and we can be kept honest by their goals. I think those of us in the advocacy community might be too easily swayed to let's eliminate solitary confinement, and there's a safer way to do this in a facility, and that's not what the community was calling for. So I think keeping that dialogue open means that we're going to push for a really a more appropriate vision of what justice should mean for our youth.
We'll have a chance tomorrow to hear some of the folks themselves who have been locked up and telling us a little bit about, in survivors' experiences, about their perspectives. And it'll be a chance for you guys to question them as well.
In our work, we've been thinking a lot about how we want to sort of work with advocates and use the visions that they are developing to really push forward new visions for the whole system. And I think part of that is, not being afraid to engage with people on the ground and making sure that people feel comfortable doing that. And part of our role, I think, even in convening this group of administrators, is to help sort of make that clear that advocates can really help, can be in your corner. I mean, sometimes I think there's this false dichotomy about the government folks are doing things and advocates are sort of pressuring them or making their lives harder or whatever, and we want to sort of eliminate some of that. And part of it is that often it's the advocates that have the sense of what is really happening on the ground and are working really hard with young people and families and have made them sort of centered in the work, and that we want that vision in our work as well. And so we've been talking a lot about when we go, and provide some kind of support to an administrator in a local or a state that is really looking to make a change but is maybe facing some serious political issues, that part of maybe what we would want to be able to press for is that everybody is coming to the table, that it's not just being driven by, the youth justice administrator, that when they're convening, events or hearings or whatever that may look like, that everybody is being brought to the table to share that perspective, to help influence that vision, and to move it forward.
Hey, my name's Jimmy. I work for KJZZ in Phoenix. So I had pretty much the exact same question that Joe brought up, because I've interviewed kids at juvenile facilities and kids held at adult facilities. And there are a lot of kids who are a danger to themselves and to others. And I mean, we say quote unquote violent, but I mean, I've talked to like a lot of kids who've like violently sexually assaulted other kids. So I mean, it's real. So I just wonder, that's the thing I always come down to, is everyone always says like, okay, let's end juvenile jails, but like, isn't it better to have a juvenile facility geared towards kids? Because if you say close juvenile jails, I think a lot of them, especially in rural communities, are just going to end up in an adult facility. And that's always like way worse. So I just question, comment.
Yeah, and I mean, I will say, I think to some degree the use of the idea end youth incarceration, or however we talk about it, we sort of intentionally are being bold and setting up a very aspirational vision, because if you start small, you're going to end small, right? I think that the way this world works and the way that change often works in this space, particularly given our country's history, is that it's easy to go with no change or very little incremental change. And I think when you want to make big change, you kind of got to start with a really big vision, and that's how we're going to get there. And to some degree, closing youth prisons is the start. And for me, saying that we want to shut down horrible state-run facilities that are hurting kids is not problematic. Like, that is actually just an important thing that we need to do. And that in its place, we need to be really creating community capacity that recognizes the full range of needs that kids have. That doesn't necessarily mean we need to build new facilities. We have plenty of things out there that we can kind of work to figure out something about. But I think it's really important that we not lose sight of the need for big visions in this field.
I just want to have a follow-up. Oh, go ahead. Answer his question. Sorry.
I'll just say briefly, I think you're right. It's real. We can't just say there's no kid ever that could benefit from some time in a really intensive treatment setting, right? I think that probably maybe one, I don't even know if one, I would say, and this is a bold statement, maybe 1% of the kids who are currently in custody might need that kind of setting, but that definitely doesn't look like what we have right now. I think you could conceivably have very short-term, very small, intensive settings for kids that have those really high needs. But I would caution that I think that I would venture to say that if you put you or me in the kind of correctional settings where we put kids now and don't address our needs, whether they be mental health or trauma, we would probably be considered, or we could be violent too. So I think I think we need to be really cautious, but I think that need might exist, but it requires a dramatic re-envisioning of what we think of those places like.
Related to that, I Art Levine, Juvenile Justice Information Exchange, freelance, but also for Newsweek, Huffington Post, other places. I want to clarify, can each of you let me know, in terms of public advocacy that you've done or are doing, are you also actively and publicly critiquing inpatient or therapeutic boarding schools or behavioral treatment facilities that are not locked down, but present themselves as, hi, we're this wonderful little benign place where we're offering psychological and medical services. But there's been loads of exposés, I've done them, and every UHS facility that has the word UHS has one, and they're not locked down, and there's lots of referrals from criminal justice and child welfare. Are you guys openly, publicly critical of the non-lockdown, non-secured, all psychological, treatment facilities of any kind?
What I'll say is that my organization, in doing our investigations, assessment, and recommendations, it's mainly for, as you mentioned, state-run facilities, county detention facilities, but often some of those state systems involve what you're kind of talking about as softer or low security kind of affiliates or satellite units where they might put youth. And so when you say critical, we are critical in terms of we've actually done evaluations of them and made recommendations for change. CCLP also just released an evaluation of close to home, kind of a process evaluation of where close to home in New York facilities are now, and those would involve low security placements.
I mean, I think that, yeah, to the extent that these different systems rely on those kinds of placement facilities for young people, and, you know, it's not clear to me that all do, some don't, but if they're treating kids not well, like, I think ultimately that's our standard. Like, we do not want kids to be hurt, regardless of, like, what the framing is, and so I think that's really important.
Yeah, I mean, I think you raise an important point. Our specific work has really been about youth prisons, and so that's where we've litigated, and and that's where I have more knowledge about what's happening. But I think this whole conversation is pointing to the, really, in some ways, it would be fabulous if we could go back in time and flip our panel with the one that came before us, because I think what they were really speaking to is we're saying this isn't working, and I think what that panel was speaking to very effectively is what are some alternatives, what really does work, and that's a key part of the conversation. We have to answer that question. I'm not trying to duck the question. I mean, I think there's been research on functional family therapy or multisystemic treatment therapy. There are programs that have evidence base, and there are also, solid community programs that don't yet have the funds for community base, but where kids are having very positive experiences. So I think, putting real attention into what works and how do we get there is very important.
Hi, Michael. I'm with the Chronicle of Social Change. This is actually a question for the room as well as the excellent panel, since we have a lot of experienced journalists here. In your experience, who are the most persuadable and accessible people in and around facilities who, for a journalist to approach to try to figure out what's happening just day to day, not about a specific kid necessarily or a specific incident? And I'd love to hear from anyone in the room really who may have done that with higher security facilities than I have, or the panel though too.
We usually persuade them by filing a lawsuit, so that probably doesn't.
Right. But you must have some backdoor, way.
I mean, I think the reality also is that we don't always file a lawsuit. Usually, we start with a letter, and that you'll find very different answers in different facilities. So there usually are allies, and there are people in this facility where we're looking at the photographs, or in the places where we're filing cases. There are people who really are allies to young people and who are in that job because they want young people to do well. But I think the room or my fellow panelists might have a better idea of how to get to them.
Sure, that sounds fine. Just because they work on facilities issues, I didn't know if maybe they'd want to chime in, but that sounds good.
Hello, my name is Danzan. I'm a reporter in Maryland, and I think it was Jenny who mentioned that how important it is to shine a light in the facility, how they operate and treat the people in there. So, from my experience working with detention centers, it seems like it's very difficult for us as journalists to get access, to negotiate access with them. Every time I go there, I have to be accompanied by a correctional officer for my own security, even though I'm only interviewing people with very low, who have been convicted of very low-level offenses. So I was wondering if you guys have any thoughts on strategies on negotiating access with detention centers, especially in this area we really have very low leverage to work with. Thanks.
I will say thank you for trying to do that work. I think it's really important. And also, I don't think there is a one easy answer. facilities don't like it when, especially if you're a journalist or a lawyer. They really don't want you inside. I mean, even when we go inside and they're allowing us, we can smell the paint, right? Like, everything changed the night before we walked in, and they told the kids, kind of what to say to us. So it is really hard to get access and get meaningful, real access. And I think probably, I would ask your colleagues as well, but from a journalist's perspective, it would be, that in some cases facilities don't, that's a thankless job in many ways. They're doing very hard jobs, and there's some of those folks who really do care about kids, oftentimes the directors, and they don't get a lot of great press. So if you kind of indicate a willingness to show, to showcase some of the positive things they're doing too. I'm not saying that they are, but if you can kind of use that angle to say, we really kind of want to understand, what are the challenges that you face and how are you addressing them with young people? I think that can be really important, and it can also really help frame for the public those kids, because in a lot of places, kids, even in media coverage, are described as offenders or inmates, and that kind of sets a tone or an example for how the public sees those kids. So I'm sorry I don't have a clear-cut answer.
And I don't have a really great answer to your question either, but I will point to some history, which just might be informative. But this really comes down to sort of leadership. But the death that I highlighted at the beginning of Daryl Thompson, Gladys Carrion, who came on soon after that and became commissioner in New York State, and basically sort of set out from very early on to want to sort of transform what was happening in New York. And part of her strategy, actually, was to develop a pretty strategic, shrewd communications plan. She worked pretty closely with her press person to essentially deploy the media to help her out what was happening in all of these facilities, and it was a campaign called Empty Beds, Wasted Dollars. And if you were to look it up, you'd probably find the more than 300 op-eds that exist and or other things from advocates. But she basically partnered with both advocacy groups and the media to sort of help make her case politically around why this all needed to change. And it was pretty phenomenal. So, I mean, you can dig around just to see, but it's sort of useful. And to the extent that some of the leaders who are now taking the reins of some of these systems, in particular as we approach an election in a few more weeks, where we're going to have 36 new governors with a lot of different appointees, like this could be a real opportunity as journalists in the room to be able to start thinking about, okay, who could I maybe, is there someone in there who really wants to shift something, and this is their window, and how would they might do that? I know that's a big question, but it's something we're thinking a lot about, and I think it might be really useful.
Just one other thought on that, which is while we can't give you access, when we do file lawsuits, then we have the complaints, and so that's a base of information. I think what happened in Wisconsin was the reporters were getting on the docket and reading every single thing that was filed in the lawsuits, and then they were going out and doing their own investigation by talking to families and other people who were not in the institutions, and were able to really paint a picture of what was happening inside.
So I was waiting for somebody to mention the election. Timing in this conference was not totally accidental. Not only is October Juvenile Justice Awareness Month, it's also a month before the midterm. So there's a roadmap there, and I'm glad we got into it. We'll get into it a bit more tomorrow. But unless there are some other questions, my God, there are. I thought you guys would be a little bit tired by now.
Do I have the mic? Okay. So my name is Charlotte West. I'm a freelance journalist based in Denver. You talk about the power of putting kids back in homes and communities rather than in detention. What about kids who don't have homes to go back to? Because there's a significant overlap between homeless youth and youth who have been involved with the criminal justice system. Have you seen any programs that sort of help to address basic needs insecurity combined with kind of helping them reintegrate back into their communities? I interviewed one young woman who she didn't use the word homeless, but she essentially got a call from her mom and said, "Oh, we lost our apartment. You better find a place to stay." So she was couch surfing, and she said, I got to do what I got to do for me. And so that's when she turned to first shoplifting and then eventually drug dealing. So I'm curious if you have any examples of innovative programs.
Maybe if one of you could answer that, because you have one more question still coming.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is like the question that comes up a lot for kids who end up in placement outside of some of the other needs we talked about is like this lack of family resource / housing that can like push a kid into the system, but also coming out, that's really hard. I know, I don't have any immediate examples. I do know that in New York, there's been sort of a concerted effort to really think about what the housing continuum could look like for kids and to develop more of the sort of independent, life skills, sort of support programming and housing. And people have been thinking about sort of supportive housing in general as a model for this sort of older youth population. But I don't have any specific examples that I could sort of point you to. I might if I dig around a little bit. So feel free to contact me later.
Sure. Hi, I'm Grace Dewey. I'm a reporter in Baton Rouge, Louisiana at The Advocate. My question was, you guys are talking a lot about state-run facilities for juveniles. I was wondering if you had any pertinent concerns about privatized juvenile justice facilities. We have one in Louisiana. I honestly don't know what it's like nationwide, but I was curious, what are the main concerns when it comes to those? It sounds like there might be a lot based on your reaction.
Well, we at Juvenile Law Center, this was not a case that I worked on, but we had a case that many of you will have heard of the Lutheran Kids for Cash scandal. So that was obviously one of the most egregious examples of what can go wrong with privatized facilities because the judges were getting kickbacks for placing the young people. But I think it is really a concern. I mean, there are problems with accountability for kids behind bars, whether they're public or private. But at least when they're public, then we have more mechanisms for getting information about what's happening and for holding facilities accountable. I don't know if you
So I also practiced in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania where there are a lot of private placements. What I've found working more broadly in other states is it varies. Some states it's basically a state-based system with county detention facilities, or sometimes the states run the detention facilities. In Pennsylvania, and I'm sure other states, there are a lot of private placements. You saw me shaking my head because I think it's a terrible way to set up a system. They're designed to make a profit. So what we would see in Philadelphia often is a private placement would say, as I think Elton mentioned a few, Glen Mills, Summit Academy, they would say, sure, we'll take this kid, knowing full well that that kid was not a good fit for their program, keep them for 6 months and bill for that time, bill whoever's paying, in that case it would be the city of Philadelphia, and then say, you know what, ultimately this kid isn't the right fit, he probably needs to go somewhere else, and then the kid would start over at another program. And in general, there's just not the kind of oversight, licensing standards that exist with private facilities. So there's really no one checking up on what they're doing, and it is surprisingly difficult in many states to even get like a report card on these places. I mean, if you were sending your kid to college or to a school, you'd want to know, like, how does this school do? How do kids who leave here fare? And that really is non-existent for many private facilities.
I'm glad someone brought up the homelessness issue. I think there's a lot of work to be done, reporting work to be done on that, and there are a couple of reports out about the intersection of homeless kids with the system. Police are obviously the first responders there. So that's really a worthy story to follow up, I think. I think we'll stop there. We'll take a final break before our final session, but please join me in thanking really great panel.